All right, we will get started. So I'm your session moderator. My name is Katie Chalk. I'm with the Midwestern Higher Education Compact. I do have a few housekeeping things I'd like to go through first. First, I just want to make sure you all keep yourself muted at the end. We will be doing questions. So you can put your questions in the chat and we'll make sure they get answered. We also have live captioning available, or subtitles, closed captioning, sorry. So if you click the button, you should be able to see that. And I think that's about it. We are recording the session, so we will get that recording posted at a later date, as well as the slides from today. So we'll get started. So this session is using OER resources in the social sciences, providing resources that matter. And your presenter today is Derek Rigg. Derek?
Hello, everyone. I am excited to be here today. I have been using OER resources for quite a while now. This is my 14th year as a professor of sociology, and I've had quite a bit of experiences ranging from great experiences with OER in terms of integrating it into sociology classes and even other social science courses, all the way to resistance and battling and fighting against utilization of OER as well. And so today I want to share with you a presentation about some myths, some realities, and looking a little bit beyond what we can do with OER, what we may have to do in terms of training for the future, especially in the social sciences, and talking about some of those pitfalls and some of those other realities that faculty and students have utilizing OER resources in the social sciences. So I will share my screen here with you. So I want to start this off by addressing a couple of things. Number one, this question of OER, but why, right? This is something I get asked questions about all the time. What do we do with it? What do we use? Why are we using it, right? And I want to share a little bit of my own sort of academic journey with you with OER, because I think it makes a larger statement about why we're kind of here today, right? And I lay this out. I said OER was considered somewhat of a joke and somewhat of as a punchline in my own timeline as an early college student. I attended college starting in the year 2000, and OER was something that was mentioned. People would say, well, it could be the wave of the future and it could disrupt this cycle, right? Because people will talk about the cycle of resources. You know, you pick a textbook, it costs money. Textbooks cost more and more money. Resources were harder and harder to find. You'd be stuck with just a few textbooks, and I'd hear professors grumble and say, well, something needs to change. Well, that became a big discussion point, but it seemed like it never did. The textbooks got more expensive. The resources got less accessible. You pay for passes, you pay for tickets, you pay for codes. So OER in the beginning seemed like a punchline, kind of a joke, like, well, there's this cycle and we all complain about it, but is there anything we could really do about it? And I marked this off as a significant point, and I share that as a story because in the beginning, people were like, very adverse towards using OER in the social sciences. And I bring this up because there's a little bit of inundation, I think, that happens at the graduate level, undergraduate level, and beyond here, right? We have a sort of academic hierarchy, right, where we don't know what OER resources are supposed to look like. There's an educational hierarchy, right? So OER can be downplayed as sort of a waste of time or has less rigorous information for undergraduate and graduate programs. And if you're like many of us in social sciences who've been through undergrad and graduate programs, we get sort of inundated with this ideology, right? I mean, we pick it up and we take it with us. And so we have a weird circle that forms out of this, right? We get inundated. We don't really get much experience with OER. Most of us don't have much experience unless we're teaching within it, right? Or unless we're actively teaching within it. And people will point and say, well, we got training. I said, but if you think about it, coming up as a social scientist, right, training's never really focused upon or offered up in terms of teaching to begin with. Majority of us who started our careers were a part of the sink or swim generation. You get a syllabus, it's blank, right? And you have some faculty members say, hey, Derek, you're going to teach your first class. And you say, okay. They said, well, here's the syllabus. we'll pick your book or let you pick your book and you go on. And I mention this because the old days of teaching in person, online, all of the educational experiences we have are really a wild west. You're out there on your own, making your own decisions with very little guidance. And now we're at a point where we've got the training, we've got the guidance, but OER training is largely unheard of and it's non-existent, right? There's a few grad programs that mention these kinds of areas. So there's a few schools that force OER training, but it hasn't caught up, right? We have heavy regulation. We have certifications and training and webinars and all these other areas where we can gain expertise and expert knowledge as we're going along, even share communities of knowledge, right? But we're so insistent, training, but the OER training coming up and through graduate programs and even into beginning adjunct, part-time, full-time positions is still absent, right? So the training element is only partially there. We stack this in terms of the social sciences with what I call the OER Educational Wall, right? It's this huge roadblock that goes up. And I started this off because I think this is something everybody goes through when trying to switch formats, when trying to integrate new elements into a class. It's hard. It's hard. We've got that comfy spot, right? And this is my own quote here, what I call it the comfy spot, right? That groove you get into, I'm confident, I know my courses for the semester, right? And when you look at OER and you look at switching resources and looking at your classes and seeing how you integrate elements in, you get a feeling as if the classes turned a little upside down, right? And one of the things I've noticed in my years in OER teaching, many professors, it doesn't matter how long they've taught or how confident you are with the course, many feel like they're out of their element. They're teaching out of their comfort zone. Some will turn to things like pedagogy, reassess teaching, looking at that methodology that they use. They think, well, these resources that I can use, right? The text, the links, the accessible links, the flexibility in this classroom, what do I need to do? And people will try to go back towards more traditional ways. They'll think of like scaffolding, building their courses in stages. Those are nice, but often that sort of scariness, which we'll talk about here on the next slide, you're building a course that maybe feels a little bit different, right? And it has pitfalls. Some of us will build ourselves sort of into a wall, and it's hard for us to imagine a different version of the course that we've always taught. And I have an example. I have a classic example. I was at a faculty meeting where we were addressing OER, its worth, its value, what can be done. And a fellow colleague of mine was just bemoaning this idea of using the book and resources and trying to find external resources for philosophy. And what had happened is that this person had taught the same course year in, year out, the same way. And they're thinking, hey, my philosophy course I've always taught is going to be significantly different, or they don't want to do it, right? And I labeled this example for us, the philosophy course that just couldn't. I can't change it. I can't get out of this wall. I've kind of built myself into a corner with how I teach. And you hit that educational wall. And I'm going to be honest, regardless of who you are, there's going to be some of these questions around these sort of OER educational wall. They're going to have. And so we bring up one of our goals here, right? Class as usual, maybe not, right? There's this myth of I want to translate my exact course regardless of format, and that may be a myth. And I know that makes some people uncomfortable in terms of OER resources and switching a course and changing or redefining a course. But I asked us to keep an open mind in terms of being honest with each other. There's going to be changes to the course that look different. The way we teach may be a little bit different. Our lectures may look different. our assignments, our assessments, they will be in a new format and they may have different outcomes, right? And an element of OER in terms of teaching, and this applies specifically to the social sciences. Again, we've got a lot of inundation about how we're supposed to teach and what that's supposed to look like. We also have a swim or fall sort of pitfall for our first teaching experiences. We're not getting the training that we need. And so one of the reasons this becomes important for us is that we may have to be more open to learning to take OER as a process, as a new class style for us to take on. We may have to be open to learning, and that's not always easy. It's not always easy, right? And I've seen the resistance to learning new academic material, and I understand that. But one of the things that OER and one of our biggest advantages for the social sciences is that we can keep the social sciences every day and relevant, right? I say, but that's difficult enough, as that pressure is very real, right? Keeping social science interesting and fascinating, right? Like I'm excited about social sciences, just saying the word, translating that into a class with different resources, with a different focus, right? With different goals and maybe different outcomes. That adds an element of scariness. And that's something in my own expertise and my own time being involved in OER. It's something that I just want to be transparent about. There is an element of scariness, and I understand that. So when people say, hey, I just want to make my OER class as usual, I don't know if you're going to get that exact same result. And that is a little bit of a scary leap, especially when you've been teaching those same courses. Like I said, you get into that groove of this is my course, I own it, this is mine. Changing that adds an element of scariness, and I understand that. Learning and relearning to use OER, to teach through OER is unknown. And for many of us, it's unfamiliar territory, right? It's an unfamiliar format. We're not getting training going through graduate school. Majority of us are not getting training and utilizing OER resources in our first jobs. We're not taking any OER skills with us. It's very much still sink or swim. And that scariness also produces something for most of us in the social sciences, a sort of hesitancy to embrace a new format. And some of you, and I use this specific example because I've heard some people in audiences before say, I feel like I'm cheating on my old classes. I'm abandoning, right? This 10-year perfect stats course I've been teaching looks and feels different, right? Or my old methods I had to change. Listen, I understand the scariness. I understand that feeling, right? Because I had those same feelings as an instructor myself. From teaching intro to social problems to upper division courses like sociological theory. I felt that way. I was like, I kind of feel like I'm cheating on my old class I put this time into and it's mine. And now I'm using these different resources. I understand it. You know, an OER education won't necessarily produce that same class with the same outcomes. But here's the secret. The outcomes that you're expecting are not the end of the world. People will say, well, I feel like I've lost a little bit of this. Well, OER has options. There are ways to make those connections. There are ways to get those outcomes. What's most important is being able to be flexible with the outcomes and find new ways. And again, scary stuff, but we need to be able to employ and do that specifically for the social sciences because we're not getting the training, we're not getting the background resources, we're not getting the first job training for OER and utilizing it and integrating it into the classroom like we should. We have a lot of inundation with very traditional methods. What about your students? What about your social science students, right? I put this up here because everybody's like, oh, will somebody please think of the children? Well, your students will survive. Your students will survive those formats, those format changes. But the real question is, will we survive it? Right? Students can enjoy the differentness of an OER course. And quite often they do They seek out OER courses to take. We get worried about the technical difficulties or too much on the technical details. But that's us, right? We put that extra worry and stress. Others say, well, you're creating a new course. And I say, yeah, that's true. We create new courses, new possibilities, but we can get some of our creativity back. We get some of that creativity back. The resources, the links, the instant accessibility, the flexibility for students. We could go over the research positives. I know we've all been hit over the head all day with those in terms of what the research says. But the creative elements are something that we don't talk about very often at all either. I've taught at institutions where they pick the textbook, they preset the course, they preset the standards. Everything is textbook company made or created. For those of us who have been in those institutions, your creativity is sort of being slowly ebbed away. And I think that's something that OER provides for us, that when we get a little bit too scared and nervous about integrating elements in, it's something to keep in the back of your mind, right? You're getting some of that creativity back, and you're getting some of your own flexibility and student flexibility back that for many of us doesn't exist. And I started that off. I said creativity institutions disappearing due to overregulation. OER helps us battle back against some of that, and specifically larger institutions where there's no flexibility. My own experience with this, and many of you are in this same boat, you could probably tell the exact same story. Being hired for a class that already exists, but it's not made by a department. It's not made by faculty that are attached to the department at all. It's a complete textbook course, right? And we have very little control over those elements and over that access, and usually they're not very flexible. I also call this my life as a grading robot, because when you're hired into these situations where the courses are very stagnant and the flexibility and accessibility is not there for students, that's kind of what you are. You're a paid grading robot, more so as a contributor. And so one of the positives I want us to take away from this is that the students are going to do just fine in terms of OER courses. The real question here is our own survival, and how will we do integrating elements in as we go along. OER education, it's not routine. It's not the same old way. It's not the same old thing. And in many ways, that's what we need to be able to do, right? And there is always a concern of keeping social sciences practical, applicable to people's everyday lives, and having an OER education that provides excellent resources on different levels. So the students, they're going to do just fine. Believe me, I've taught enough courses across enough different disciplines. The students are going to do okay. But the question for us is, how will we do? If that doesn't sell you on some of the applicability here, there's also understanding and confronting our own anxieties that goes along with this. There's always going to be panic about student success. But is that really just a front for things? Right? We can ask questions in meaningful surveys. We can get quality evaluation and feedback based on OER courses, how OER courses are executed, how the material is, accessibility and flexibility for students. We can do some introspection and ask those larger questions and get quality feedback. Others are worried about student success and even faculty success. Right? So, but one of the things that needs to change for OER is integrating that training and getting people interested in teaching in OER before they've left graduate school. That also means abandoning some of the sink or swim mentality from the old school days of coming up through teaching programs. The other scary thing, and I know I hear this all the time about the technology aspect of things, I think we have to admit sometimes that we're human, and that's hard. It's hard. We're professors. We have PhDs. We have master's degrees. Some of you have multiple PhDs and graduate degrees and certificates. It's hard to admit sometimes we have gaps, technological gaps, methodological gaps, pedagogical gaps. But successfully integrating and understanding how OER can function and what it can provide for social science courses, sometimes we have to admit what those gaps are. And there has to be a human element that's there. There has to be a human element that's there. I started this off as important because we have the ability to change this, right? And we already are. Right? We're requiring training. We're picking up webinars. Most institutions now are allowing us to have sandbox courses. Specifically, community colleges are allowing us to have sandbox courses where we can play around with a copied version of the class and we can make mistakes, right? We can make mistakes. We can go through and try new things, and it's not going to be harmful to a course that we're making or the modules that we're making, right? We get some of that back. It helps reduce some of that stress and confronting some of those anxieties about utilizing OER resources. And in terms of importance, that's what we need to be able to do. As long as we can integrate those elements and let ourselves make mistakes, address those gaps, we can produce OER classes that are just as successful, just as legitimate, with just the resources that students need as any other concept or any other context for more traditional methods. Other things that will help with sort of the stress and anxiety, changing assessment, having personal assessment, adding questions into the institutional expectations for student success. Those things will have to change. So OER success, analysis of that success, student surveys are needed for feedback. The other thing I'm going to encourage, which I have not seen, but I have seen other conferences discuss this topic, is professor-faculty feedback on the usage of OER resources and how they function within the classroom as well. And I think that's something, I highlighted this in yellow for on purpose, it's something we have to do going forward to continue to make positive changes and to make sure that what we're doing with OER in terms of the perspective, the pedagogy, the teaching is working, not just for the students, but it's working for the professors and faculty who are involved as well. Right? And many of us have the options to add those questions to the end of the semester. And I implore you to do that, even on an individual personal level, even if it's not institutional. We need to be doing this. We need to be operating from a stance where we can improve that success. Something else that may have to change is the stress on assessment. The standard assessment for semesters and how we do in-person courses may not suffice. If our assessment has changed or the way in which we pursue assessment has changed, that's something that we need to make sure that we are putting into perspective. I've heard other people complain or say they're concerned about departments, institutions, tenure review committees, changing their perspective on assessment and online changes. And that may be something that has to be assessed as well, especially if you're in a department where half of the faculty are using OER actively and the other half are not. Having that assessment aspect being judged fairly for the work that you're doing and the successes and the attempts to grow OER as well, those also have to be put into some perspective. And that's not just important for us who are social science professors or social science faculty and social science teachers. It's something that's important across the board. What does this really allow us to do? Right? What does this mean for the social sciences? We have advantages, right? And I mentioned one of the keys, one of the big secrets is that OER gives us that relevancy and that everydayness and gives us some control and creative control back that many of us have lost. If you haven't, that's fantastic. But for many of us teaching in different schools and different institutions, we've lost a lot of that. And so I come from a perspective where there's a wide range of possibilities, right? So I see OER as cumulative sets of resources. We can update modules quickly. We can update content. We can find new links. We can use different types of resources that are socially relevant to that week's course content. And it's not that we couldn't do it before, but that flexibility and accessibility of those types of resources are out there, right? We get that control back over course content, which is important for the social science disciplines. You know, social science isn't about grading robots, and it's not about painting us into a corner or individually painting ourselves into a corner or putting ourselves into a wall. We have to make those adjustments and those updates, but having that control back is important, right? It gives us that creativity, but it gives us sort of the freedom to teach and to get the ideas out that we're trying to translate for our respective courses. You know, this is especially the case for those that create and maintain their own college campus text. For example, Delta College has their own text and their own resources and access. Being a faculty and having an active pursuit where you can contribute and be an active participant in the OER process in terms of departmental and individual decisions, even to having an impact on how the text is put together, is just one example of getting that creative control and getting that impactful control back that many of us have lost in classrooms. One thing that's been missing is a building of community and the sharing of resources, right? When I say this widespread sharing of information between colleges and university gives the social sciences that opportunity to be that current relevant course, right? We can provide extra resources, historical resources, detailed resources, conceptual resources, right? And we have a shared community and shared elements, so we can pull that off in a way that other disciplines may not have the access to the same resources, but we do, right? So we can take some of that and do some fantastic things with courses that traditionally we wouldn't think of doing. OER is a community. I know that sounds cheesy, and it makes me smile a little bit because that's one of the most powerful elements that we have in the social sciences, is that building of communication between academics and teachers and researchers, sharing that knowledge that is accessible for students. I sometimes think when you've been in OER so long, you don't think about that, right? But when you're removed from it and those other elements aren't there, having that knowledge base and being able to share, even having a conference such as this, the OER Summit, is fantastic. It's fantastic. Other elements for social sciences that we take for granted is that OER does close inequity gaps in relation to classroom affordability, reduces textbook and overall course costs, reduces the cost of students in terms of having access to the course, right? Buying a code or a ticket or a card to gain access on top of paying the credit hours for the course. It closes some of those gaps and in deeply profound ways. Students can enjoy instant access to resources with classes that share in everyday relation. If you have an assignment where students can add back links, using their own wiki pages, creating their own elements within the OER class itself, you get students who are attached to the course, right? And that's one of the beautiful things I've seen with OER courses over the last several years now. When students have that vested stake and they have that access where they need to be, they will comment, they will turn in their own ideas, and they will feel comfortable with that. And I think that's another one of those elements we take for granted. That access, that flexibility, that connection that's there makes a difference. And when we think that it doesn't, we're kind of fooling ourselves, because it's significantly different in terms of the students who read, the students who ask questions, the students who want feedback. It's much different than having the textbook, the code, the card, everything else that goes with the course. Social science faculty, we're not limited. We can choose from thousands of options, almost hundreds of thousands of options in terms of finding resources, creating shareable resources that's instantly accessible, right? And that's not a mystery, right? But we have that at our fingertips, right? And then someone who's coming from a pre-OER, OER acceptance, now OER training, and an OER being integrated into classrooms, that's an amazing point to be at, because remember in our first slide, as somebody who started their education in the year 2000, OER was more of a punchline. People were kind of thinking that it's not something that's going to stick around for the future. Well, it did. What can we take away? Social sciences can greatly benefit from OER adoption, but we've got to fight some battles. Some of it is academic battles coming through our graduate programs of study. Some of it deals with training and training of how to teach, having a pedagogy and a method. Other elements come from having OER training through your first jobs, through institutions who utilize OER consistently. We do have to fight back against, still, for whatever reason, resources that are equivalent or the same as a standard textbook. But we can benefit, but we have to let go of some of those big battles from the past. We also need to come to a sort of conclusion that it aligns with the need to share and create relevant information, right? And that means drawing from a community. That means being involved in a community that shares and is a part of that process. You know, and another thing that goes with the textbook element here that I think we've all experienced, even as students, we'll pay $100, $150, $200 for a textbook. And I've even seen that for post-secondary education textbooks as well, where the students get the book, they get the text, and it's outdated before it's even used. Or the text hasn't been updated in forever and it seems more historical than currently relevant. And so I see that a lot, and it's disappointing as a student to spend hundreds of dollars to get texts that aren't relevant, that are more historical, or don't really include topics that are relevant in the here and now. OER allows us as social science to gain and keep its relevance. You know, how does this apply to me? How is this impactful in my everyday life? What's going on right now where this makes sense, where I can draw my examples from? OER provides that, and it provides it in maybe a different way than what we're used to. Again, it's a very different way of teaching and utilizing resources. That creativity, that instant access back to resources for faculty and students is a real game changer in many ways. And for those of you who were grading robots or are grading robots or are just there teaching a class, but there's no creativity in there, one of the things that I could definitely speak to in my own expertise is that getting that creativity, getting that access back where you change, you put the resources in, you get the relevancy there, is exciting. It's exciting. And for those of you who teach in those situations, OER offers a way, a sort of exit out of that situation. And it's something that I don't think many people are really discussing and talking about. The strength of OER, what the research says, what we've probably all experienced at this point, it's already being proven, right? We hear the same thing. Courses taught continue to provide evidence of effectiveness and relevance for the social sciences. Comes up all the time. Students enjoy their courses. There's less drop off. There's better retention. Students read and utilize resources because it's easily accessible. They look at OER courses as a less stressful classroom experience, right? And a major part of that is closing the gaps in educational funding and resource funding as well. I see the same thing replicated. Course evaluations, added survey questions, They demonstrate the same overall impact in almost all the OER courses I've been attached to lifetime. And it's been dozens and dozens of different types of courses at this point. It's not just a bunch of research, and I don't want to leave you with a bunch of research stuff. What I want you to pick up on for this end here is that as you teach OER courses and you're doing your assessments and you're changing some of those course goals, um, that impact that you're having is real and it is significant and it does contribute to what your students are learning in the classroom. Um, it's not some sort of limitation. I know it flies in the face of a lot of what we've been inundated and brought up with as social science teachers, especially professors and faculty, where it's sink or swim. Um, it flies in the face of a lot of that early teaching upbringing. And so when you get those evaluations, when you add those survey questions, there's a little bit of personal feedback there, this personal assessment that's there, but it also gives you some context for what it is you're doing and why. Okay, OER is hard work and it does take time to do, but it does pay off. And having some of that confirmation is important for us on our end as we continue to try to integrate OER resources into schools, into majors and minors. Again, I know it's not easy. What is the future? I have just a few more minutes here. What is the future? Well, OER shared resources across the social science gives us strength. It allows us to empower and reach students in ways that were previously viewed as not viable. OER was thought to be a trend, a fad, really kind of derided and put down, less academic, less rigorous. Well, fast forward to 2021, right? We're fast forwarding 20 plus years. OER is viable and it is reaching our students and it is changing the way that they learn and it is making for a better classroom experience. Many of us at presentation today have begun or solely utilize OER resources on a regular basis, right? And that indicates a major change on how people view courses, their class design, and education on the whole. OER has resources, it has communities, it has resources to share. OER is a part of education. It's not a fad, it's not a trend. It's an option for educational opportunities to provide resources to students and a different classroom experience, again, in a way that we just didn't see as viable or possible in the past. What about the continued focus on OER? The research continues to show it's an effective way to teach and impact students. It's already illustrated, demonstrated its utility, right? And now we're in a position to make major decisions regarding the future usage of OER. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this presentation today and talk about these various aspects of OER in terms of social sciences is that we're at a critical point where we can make these major decisions about integrating OER resources and having more control, more creative control, and setting more standards and training and teaching standards before our first job, before that first contract comes out. We've got more options and more opportunities to continue along an OER path and to continue to do what it's always done, making for a better classroom experience, better accessibility and flexibility for students. And I'll leave you with this, and this is my honest 14 years teaching experience summation of things, seeing the difference in student participation and their positives that they have to say about the course and the resources. It's just something you really can't put into words 100%. I mean, there are students who can't afford a textbook. They can barely afford to be at college. Having that be a turnaround, having them being able to contribute to class in different ways, it's something I really can't describe in words, other than it's an amazing feeling to teach a course where everyone has their educational access. Some of those gaps are eliminated and students are able to really shine and show off their knowledge, their creativity, their ideas. OER has provided that for me in terms of my courses as a 14-year social science teaching veteran here. It's just something I wouldn't believed possible when I first started. And I hope today's presentation gets you just as excited and just as pumped up about OER as myself. Thank you everybody today for being here. I look forward to answering some of the questions here. I think Katie's going to read them aloud, but thank you so much for having me today. I've really appreciated sharing some of that OER knowledge with everyone today. So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Derek. We do have one question. It was asked early on, so I feel like you might have touched on some of this, but it was, how can librarians and other OER advocates help faculty deal with the scariness factor?
That's a big one. And I've actually have a little experience here. One thing I suggest doing is, if you're going to create OER, like OER links and OER contacts to websites and other areas, sit down with your librarian, sit down with the social sciences librarian, have a small meeting, talk about what resources you want to use, things that you've seen that work and don't work in tandem, right? Because one of the things that's going to happen is if my sociology department is really gung-ho on OER and they're really involved, you want to make that connection with the library as soon as possible, right? Because one of the cool things about being a librarian is they also attend conferences and they also have opportunities to purchase or make requests for different types of resource access. And that's critical. You know, just having those conversations, having those dialogues, even if there's a person who's assigned to OER resources through the library specifically, do a meeting, reach out, say, hey, my name is Derek. This is what I teach using my courses. I'm using OER actively. Extend that dialogue out, because librarians, regardless if they're research librarians or full-on librarians or they're part-time, they have connections, they have resources, and they know people, and that's going to help you with those courses. And it's going to help people direct themselves to the library's website, because a lot of times they're attached to the library's website. So, I mean, that's a fantastic relationship to have. And if you can have that, if you have an institution that supports that, do it. Do it. Just ask. You know, that's the best advice I have, because if you don't ask, you don't know, one. And two, having an extra ally, having somebody else who supports what it is that you're doing, is going to help you that much farther into the future.
Awesome. Christina says that's a great point. Librarians are an important partner.
Yes.
Great. Do you have any perspective on, if there are a library, and how to encourage faculty or make it less scary for the faculty to start using OERs?
One of the things I've seen at 2 institutions now is that they have a small web page with some beginning articles, beginning links, or beginning that process of what OER is and how the resources function. Having links on how OER works, right? What is it? What do I do? And what does that mean for my classroom? I think having some of those kind of educational links, and even videos, right? Videos that talk about switching courses over or integrating OER resources and what that means, right? Because there's all this shared copyright and things that you have to be sort of aware of in terms of what to do. And speaking of copyright, that's a big part of it too, alleviating some of the fears about, you know, sharing resources and what that means, and taking your own resources and getting them set up to be an OER resource to share with others. It's not a difficult process, but nobody talks about really how to do it unless you get some formal training. And I've been at 2 institutions now where the library has that active role. There is an OER OER resource tab in the upper right corner for the library where you can go and get that access, and then have contact information for your point of contact, whoever's actively involved in that institution. You know, those are some things that are possibilities. You know, but a big thing for me for some of that scariness is getting that dialogue going, so that the resources are there and they're real, and then trying to build from there. And I think sometimes that's where more sometimes the scariness is the social part of it, and trying to get out there and say, hey, I want to put my foot in the door. This is what I want to do. But I've seen amazing things from libraries in terms of providing OER web links and resource links that are direct. So there are social science direct links, educational resource links for distance ed and online learning. Like I have this at the end of here. Digital tools and teacher support. You can have those links that are available, and it makes it a little bit easier. The other thing that goes along with it is that there's something you have to subscribe to, or there's a paid subscription to. You want to know if you can get access to that as soon as possible. And that's a big deal. One thing I'll share with you right now is that if you teach a social science statistics course or a social science and behavioral statistics course in any social science classroom setting, there are dozens and dozens of OER resources, and some of them do require you to have some instant access or maybe pay a very small fee to be a part of, but they work, right? But having that access and knowing that, that's the biggest role. And some of that scariness can be reduced. If you're working in tandem with someone else to help provide resources, or to have a sort of set of connections for resources, some of that scariness can disappear, right? Because then you don't feel like you're by yourself, or you're not the only one making these changes. You're not the only one who's undergoing a change in their classroom style, potentially. So it's nice to know that there are others who are a part of that. In terms of making giant leaps, it's hard. It's hard. Relinquishing some control or adjusting class in a certain way. Sometimes it's hard to remove some of those OER educational walls. But the biggest advice is to do things in steps and stages. And I know that sounds corny, and it probably is. It sounds a little bit old school, but it's kind of to put one foot in front of the other. Because once you start to see smaller incremental changes, and then you're continuing to build, you do see something that's different, that has that different feel. And the best advice over all these years of teaching OER and OER online specifically, do it in steps and stages, do it in pieces. Don't feel that pressure and stress that I have an entire class to do. Start at that very small piece and component, and then just barely move, make your moves forward. But carrying too much stress of this whole class has to change, this whole class radically has to look different, that gets kind of everybody in sort of shutdown mode, or this is too big of a project for me to handle, or you just get frustrated, like, why am I doing this? Like, what's going to happen as a payoff? And too big makes it seem untenable, like I can't do this. But those small steps, those components, those pieces, if you do it in that model, it begins to make more sense. And that's something that it's hard to convince you of unless you're in the process and you're doing it in steps and stages. But that other seems too large. And that's one of the reasons I put that in there specifically. There's an added bonus as well with stress teaching online during the pandemic. Most of us teach in person. I'm an in-person faculty most of the time. To do distance ed and to stack OER on top, it's a lot, and it seems big. And so part of that comfort zone stuff comes into play. But again, steps and stages, take it small. If you get frustrated, remember this, you can always ask questions, right? Send out an email, contact your distance ed or the people who are there who are supposed to be helping incrementally as you're going along. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to feel confused. It's okay to make mistakes making the course. It's okay, but that too big to handle, you got to take it in steps and stages. And I've been there myself, so I'm not telling you advice that I wouldn't follow myself. I've been there. They say, well, you got to take this OER in person now and convert it to online. And I'm thinking, how do I do that? It's got to be with those steps and stages.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you very much, Derek. That was great. We are done for this session. Up next at 1:15, we'll do our lunch and network. So we encourage you to grab a lunch and come join us and network with other colleagues. And we will see you this afternoon soon. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.